My name is Penelope Richardson, and last 4th of July, my Uncle Marcus stood in front of my entire extended family, held up my self-published novel, and announced to everyone that I had been wasting 7 years of my life writing what he called absolute toilet paper. He laughed as he tossed my book into the barbecue pit, watching the pages curl and burn while my cousins snickered and my aunts shook their heads in embarrassment. That moment of public humiliation was supposed to be the end of my writing dreams. Instead, it became the beginning of the most extraordinary vindication of my life. What happened 3 months later would not only prove Uncle Marcus wrong, but would change everything I thought I knew about perseverance, family, and the power of believing in yourself when nobody else will. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I'm 29 years old and work as a part-time librarian in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business and dreams are often seen as luxuries that practical people can't afford. For the past 7 years, every spare moment of my life has been dedicated to one goal: becoming a published author. Not just any author, but a novelist whose stories could touch hearts and change lives the way my favorite books had changed mine when I was growing up. The path to this dream began when I was 8 years old, sitting in the children's section of the very library where I now work. My parents, Robert and Catherine Richardson, had just gone through a messy divorce that left our small family fractured and struggling. While other kids my age were playing video games or watching cartoons, I escaped into the worlds created by authors like Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, and later, contemporary writers like Jodi Picoult and Nicholas Sparks. These books didn't just entertain me, they showed me that stories had the power to heal, to help people understand themselves and others, and to create connection across all kinds of differences. By the time I reached high school, I knew with absolute certainty that I wanted to write novels that could do for others what those books had done for me. I started keeping journals, writing short stories, and dreaming about the day when I would see my name on the cover of a book in that same library where I had first discovered the magic of storytelling. College at Penn State was where I really began to take my writing seriously. I majored in English literature with a creative writing focus, spending countless hours in workshops where professors and classmates critiqued my work. Some of the feedback was encouraging, but much of it was brutal. Professor Williams, my senior year fiction workshop instructor, once told me that my writing was emotionally manipulative and that I relied too heavily on sentimental themes that lack literary sophistication. Those words stung deeply, but they also fueled my determination to prove that stories about real human emotions and struggles could be both meaningful and well-crafted. After graduation, I faced the reality that most aspiring writers encounter. The literary world is incredibly competitive, and making a living from writing alone is nearly impossible. I moved back to Millbrook and took the part-time position at the library, which gave me access to thousands of books for research and inspiration, plus the flexible schedule I needed to write during my off hours. My family's reaction to my career choice was less than supportive from the beginning. My father, who worked as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant, couldn't understand why I would choose such an impractical path when I could have used my college degree to get a real job with benefits and security. My mother, who had remarried and moved to Florida, would call occasionally and ask when I was going to give up playing around with stories and start building a serious career, but it was Uncle Marcus who was the most vocal critic of my dreams. Marcus Richardson was my father's older brother, a successful insurance agent who owned a large house in the suburbs of Philadelphia and drove expensive cars. He had always been the family success story, the one everyone pointed to as an example of what you could achieve with hard work and practical thinking. Marcus had never been married, had no children, and seemed to view my writing aspirations as a personal affront to the family's work ethic and common sense. During family gatherings, Marcus would make pointed comments about how I was wasting my education and my 20s on something that would never pay the bills. He would bring up statistics about how few authors actually make money from their writing, and how most people who dream of literary success end up disappointed and financially unstable. His criticism wasn't just discouraging, it was detailed and seemingly well-researched, which made it even more devastating. Despite the lack of family support, I threw myself into my writing with the intensity of someone who knew that success was the only way to silence the doubters. My routine became sacred and unbreakable. Every morning before my library shift, I would wake up at 5 a.m. and write for 2 hours. During my lunch breaks, I would edit and revise the previous day's work. Evenings and weekends were dedicated to researching agents, studying the publishing industry, and continuing to craft and refine my stories. My first novel took me 3 years to complete. It was a contemporary women's fiction story about 3 generations of women in a family dealing with secrets, forgiveness, and the complicated bonds that tie mothers and daughters together. The story drew heavily from my own experiences with family dysfunction, but it was filtered through fictional characters whose lives were both more dramatic and more hopeful than my own reality. The process of finding an agent was brutal and demoralizing. I sent out over 200 query letters over the course of 18 months. Most went unanswered. Of those who responded, the vast majority were form rejections that provided no feedback about what wasn't working. A few agents requested partial manuscripts, which raised my hopes, only to reject the work after reading the first 50 pages. The personal rejections were the hardest to handle because they often contained specific criticisms that echoed what I had been hearing from my family. The market is oversaturated with family drama stories. The themes are too familiar and don't offer a fresh perspective. While the writing is competent, it lacks the unique voice that would make it stand out in today's competitive marketplace. After 2 years of rejections, I made the decision that would later become a source of family ridicule. I decided to self-publish. The stigma around self-publishing was still strong, especially among people like my family who viewed it as admitting defeat. But I had researched successful self-published authors and learned that many had built substantial readerships and even caught the attention of traditional publishers through their independent efforts. I spent 6 months learning about cover design, formatting, marketing, and all the business aspects of self-publishing that traditional publishers typically handle. I hired a professional editor with money I had saved from my library job, working with Sarah Chen, a freelance editor who had previously worked at several major publishing houses. Sarah's feedback was encouraging. She told me that while my story needed some structural adjustments, my voice was authentic and my character development was strong. The financial investment in self-publishing was significant for someone living on a part-time librarian salary. Between editing, cover design, formatting, and initial marketing efforts, I spent nearly $3,000 of my carefully saved money. This expenditure became another source of family criticism, particularly from Uncle Marcus, who saw it as throwing good money after bad. When Threads of Grace was finally published on Amazon and other platforms, I felt a mixture of pride and terror. This book represented 7 years of dreams, thousands of hours of work, and a significant financial investment. The initial sales were modest but steady. I sold about 50 copies in the first month, mostly to friends and library patrons who knew about my writing. The reviews from readers were overwhelmingly positive. People wrote about how the story had made them think about their own family relationships, how they had stayed up all night reading because they couldn't put the book down, and how the characters felt real and relatable. These reviews meant everything to me because they confirmed that my stories could indeed connect with readers in the meaningful way I had always hoped, but positive reader reviews didn't translate to family acceptance or financial success. After 6 months, I had sold fewer than 500 copies total, earning about $800 in royalties. Uncle Marcus used these numbers as ammunition for his ongoing criticism, pointing out that I was making less than minimum wage for all the time I had invested in the project. The lack of significant sales was discouraging, but I refused to give up. I started working on my second novel while continuing to market the first through social media, book blogger outreach, and local library events. This second book was more ambitious in scope, dealing with themes of racial tension, economic inequality, and the power of education to transform communities. The story was set in a fictional small town very much like Millbrook, and it drew from my observations of the social and economic challenges facing rural Pennsylvania communities. Writing the second novel while working and marketing the first was exhausting. My social life, which had already been limited, became virtually non-existent. I declined invitations to parties, dates, and family events that conflicted with my writing schedule. Friends started calling less frequently, and I understood why. When someone consistently prioritizes their creative work over social relationships, those relationships naturally begin to fade. The most challenging aspect wasn't the isolation or the long hours, but the constant doubt that crept in during quiet moments. Late at night, after spending hours revising a difficult chapter or receiving another lukewarm review, I would wonder if Uncle Marcus and the others were right. Maybe I was deluding myself about my talent. Maybe I was wasting precious years of my life on something that would never amount to anything meaningful. But every time these doubts threatened to overwhelm me, I would remember why I had started writing in the first place. I would reread some of the heartfelt reviews from readers who had connected with Threads of Grace, or I would think about the 8-year-old girl in the library who had found solace and hope in other people's stories. Those memories would remind me that even if my writing never made me rich or famous, it had already proven its worth by touching the lives of the readers who had found meaning in my work. The second novel, Bridges We Build, took me 2.5 years to complete. By the time I published it, I had developed a small but loyal readership from the first book. The launch was more successful, with initial sales of about 200 copies in the first month and more consistent marketing momentum. The reviews were again positive, with readers praising the book's social consciousness and emotional depth. However, the improved reception of the second book didn't change my family's perception of my career choice. If anything, their skepticism seemed to intensify as years passed without any dramatic breakthrough or financial success. Uncle Marcus began making jokes about my hobby and suggesting that I was getting too old to continue living in what he called Fantasyland. By the time I started working on my third novel, I had been writing seriously for 7 years with modest but meaningful results. I had published 2 books, built a small readership, and received recognition from local literary organizations. More importantly, I had proven to myself that I could complete complex creative projects and connect with readers through my storytelling. The third book was my most personal and ambitious project yet. Titled The Weight of Wings, it told the story of a young woman who dreams of becoming a pilot in the 1940s, facing opposition from her family and society while pursuing her passion despite seemingly impossible obstacles. The parallels to my own experience as a woman pursuing an unconventional dream were intentional, though I filtered the themes through historical fiction to give them broader resonance. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. This novel took me 3 years to write, and during that time, my family's criticism reached new levels of intensity. Uncle Marcus stopped asking about my writing progress and instead began making pointed comments about women my age who were settling down and starting families. He would mention friends' daughters who had gotten promotions at their corporate jobs or bought houses, always with the implication that I was falling behind in life because of my impractical career choice, the financial reality of pursuing a writing career while living on a part-time librarian salary meant that every aspect of my life revolved around maximizing time and money for my craft. My apartment was a converted studio above Morrison's hardware store on Main Street, accessible only through a narrow external staircase that creaked ominously during winter storms. The rent was $485 per month, which was manageable on my $1,200 monthly income, but it left little room for luxuries or even basic comforts. The space itself was roughly 350 square feet, with a kitchenette that consisted of a mini refrigerator, a 2-burner hot plate, and a sink barely large enough to wash a dinner plate. My bed was a futon that doubled as my couch during the day, positioned directly beneath the single window that faced the alley behind the hardware store. The view was uninspiring: dumpsters, delivery trucks, and the back entrance to Chen's Chinese restaurant, but the natural light was adequate for reading and writing during daylight hours. My writing desk was a folding card table I had purchased at a garage sale for $12, paired with a mismatched chair rescued from the library's discard pile. This makeshift office occupied the corner near the window, surrounded by towers of books I had collected over the years, most purchased secondhand or borrowed indefinitely from the library's donation box. The precarious stacks of novels, writing guides, and research materials created a literary fortress around my workspace, making the cramped apartment feel even smaller but somehow more purposeful. The heating system in the apartment was unreliable. At best, consisting of a single baseboard heater that wheezed and clanked throughout the winter months while producing barely enough warmth to prevent ice from forming on the inside of the windows. During particularly cold spells in January and February, I would write while wearing multiple layers of clothing, fingerless gloves, and a wool hat, my breath visible in small puffs as I typed. The electric bill for supplemental heating was prohibitive. So I learned to embrace the cold as part of the authentic struggling artist experience. My transportation was a 2008 Ford Focus that I had inherited from my grandmother when she passed away 3 years earlier. The car had 147,000 miles on the odometer when I received it, and by the time of the infamous barbecue, it had accumulated another 45,000 miles through my daily commutes to the library and occasional trips to visit family or attend literary events. The air conditioning had failed during my second summer of ownership, and I couldn't afford the $800 repair estimate, so I had grown accustomed to driving with the windows down and arriving at destinations slightly disheveled from the wind. The vehicle's most problematic feature was an intermittent electrical issue that caused the radio and dashboard lights to flicker unpredictably, sometimes leaving me driving in complete darkness except for the headlights. A mechanic had quoted $600 to diagnose and repair the problem, money that I instead allocated toward editing services for my second novel. I rationalized that the car still transported me reliably from point A to point B, and the occasional automotive adventure added character to my daily routine. My wardrobe reflected the same practical approach to spending that governed every other aspect of my life. The majority of my clothing came from thrift stores in neighboring towns, carefully selected pieces that could be mixed and matched to create the appearance of a more extensive closet. I had become an expert at finding designer items with tags still attached, donated by wealthy women who had purchased clothes impulsively and never worn them. My entire professional wardrobe for library work consisted of 6 pieces, 2 pairs of dress pants, 2 blouses, a cardigan, and a blazer, all purchased for less than $60 total. Shopping for groceries required the same strategic approach as building a wardrobe. I maintained a detailed spreadsheet tracking prices at different supermarkets, planning my routes to hit multiple stores when sales cycles aligned favorably. Couponing became a serious hobby, with Sunday mornings dedicated to clipping and organizing discounts that could reduce my weekly food budget from $45 to $32. My meals consisted primarily of pasta, rice, canned beans, seasonal vegetables when they were deeply discounted, and occasional splurges on chicken when it dropped below 99 cents per pound. The social sacrifices required by my lifestyle were perhaps more challenging than the physical discomforts of cold apartments and unreliable transportation. My college friends had moved to cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Washington, D.C., building careers in marketing, finance, and consulting that afforded them disposable income for restaurants, concerts, and weekend getaways. Their social media posts featured dinner parties at trendy restaurants, vacation photos from beach resorts, and celebrations of professional achievements that seemed impossibly glamorous compared to my quiet existence in Millbrook. When these friends visited their families during holidays, they would occasionally suggest meeting for dinner or drinks, invitations that I had to decline repeatedly due to budgetary constraints. A single dinner at the type of restaurant they favored would consume my entire weekly food budget, and drinks afterward would eliminate any possibility of buying groceries for several days. Initially, I would explain my financial limitations honestly, but the awkward conversations that followed made it clear that my lifestyle choices were difficult for them to understand or relate to. Eventually, the invitations became less frequent, and then stopped altogether. Social relationships naturally drift apart when one person consistently cannot participate in normal social activities, and I understood why this happened even though it was painful to experience. My friend Jessica, who had been my roommate junior year, sent me a text message after I declined her third invitation to a weekend in Atlantic City. "I get that money's tight, but you have to live a little. You're missing out on your 20s because of this writing obsession." The accusation stung because there was truth in it, but Jessica couldn't understand that I had made a conscious choice to invest my 20s in building something meaningful rather than accumulating experiences that would fade from memory. Every dollar I didn't spend on entertainment was money that could be invested in my craft through editing services, cover design, or marketing efforts. Every weekend I spent writing instead of socializing was progress toward the goal that mattered more to me than temporary pleasures. Dating became virtually impossible under these circumstances, though I told myself this was temporary and ultimately acceptable. The few men I met through library events or community activities were inevitably put off by my unconventional living situation and single-minded focus on writing. One promising relationship with David, a teacher at the local high school, ended abruptly after he visited my studio apartment and commented that it looked like a homeless person's camp made out of books. His criticism wasn't necessarily unfair, but it revealed how incompatible my current lifestyle was with normal relationship expectations. The most painful social sacrifice involved missing major life events of people I cared about. My college roommate Amy's wedding in Charleston required a bridesmaid dress, hotel accommodations, and travel expenses that would have consumed 4 months of my discretionary spending. When I explained that I couldn't afford to participate, Amy was understanding but disappointed, and our friendship never fully recovered from my absence at one of the most important days of her life. Similar situations arose regularly: baby showers that required gifts and travel, birthday celebrations at expensive restaurants, and family events that conflicted with my writing schedule or required spending money I had allocated for publishing expenses. Each declined invitation felt like another small death of my social connections, but I remained convinced that these sacrifices were temporary investments in a future that would ultimately justify the isolation. The most consistent source of external pressure came from my extended family's persistent requests for financial assistance, despite my obvious lack of disposable income. My cousin Bradley, who worked sporadically in construction, had developed a pattern of calling me when he needed money for car repairs, utility bills, or other emergencies that seemed to occur with suspicious regularity. These requests were typically for amounts between $50 and $200, accompanied by promises of repayment that materialized only occasionally and usually only partially. My Aunt Dorothy, Uncle Marcus's sister-in-law, had a different approach to seeking family financial support. She would invite me to lunch, during which she would casually mention her struggles with credit card debt, medical bills, or home repairs that exceeded her budget. These lunches invariably concluded with subtle requests for loans that were framed as opportunities for me to demonstrate family loyalty and solidarity. The amounts were usually smaller than Bradley's direct requests, but they occurred more frequently and were harder to refuse without seeming callous. Uncle Marcus himself never directly asked me for money, but he had developed an annoying habit of making pointed comments about my financial priorities whenever he learned about my publishing expenses. When I mentioned spending money on professional editing services, he would launch into detailed explanations of how that money could have been invested in index funds or used to reduce debt. His financial lectures were particularly galling because he had no understanding of the publishing industry or the investments required to produce professional quality books. The pressure from family members to contribute financially to their various needs was complicated by my genuine affection for many of them and my understanding that their requests often stemmed from legitimate hardships. However, every dollar I lent to family members was money that could have been invested in my writing career, creating a constant tension between family loyalty and professional advancement. Over the course of 7 years, I estimated that I had lent or given approximately $3,200 to various family members, money that I never tracked carefully because doing so would have made the resentment unbearable. My strategy for managing family financial requests evolved over time from generous accommodation to increasingly firm boundaries. I learned to distinguish between genuine emergencies and poor planning, between one-time crises and patterns of irresponsible behavior. This education in family dynamics was painful but necessary, teaching me that enabling other people's financial problems was neither helpful to them nor sustainable for me. The most difficult aspect of maintaining these boundaries was dealing with the guilt and manipulation that followed when I declined requests for money. Family members would remind me of past favors they had done for me, question my priorities, and suggest that my writing career was selfish because it prevented me from being more generous with relatives who were struggling. These conversations were emotionally exhausting and often left me questioning whether I was indeed being selfish by pursuing my dreams instead of focusing more on family needs. The isolation imposed by my lifestyle choices was intensified by the nature of writing itself, which requires long periods of solitary concentration and introspection. During the most productive phases of working on a novel, I would spend entire weekends alone in my studio apartment, emerging only to buy groceries or attend my library shifts. The characters in my stories became more real and immediate than the people in my actual life, their problems more engaging than the routine challenges of my daily existence. This immersion in fictional worlds was both necessary for producing compelling stories and potentially unhealthy for maintaining perspective on reality. I began to notice that I was more comfortable expressing myself through my characters than through direct personal communication, more articulate in describing fictional emotions than in discussing my own feelings. The boundary between my identity as a person and my identity as a writer became increasingly blurred, which was probably inevitable given the extent to which writing dominated every aspect of my life. The physical toll of maintaining this lifestyle for 7 years was significant but often overlooked in my focus on creative and financial goals. Sitting at my makeshift desk for hours each day created chronic back and neck pain that I couldn't afford to address through professional treatment. The stress of constant financial pressure manifested in tension headaches, disrupted sleep patterns, and a persistent low-level anxiety that colored every decision I made about spending money. My diet, while economically efficient, was nutritionally inadequate and contributed to fatigue that made the long hours of writing even more challenging. I rarely ate fresh fruits or vegetables, surviving primarily on processed foods that were shelf-stable and inexpensive. The occasional comments from library patrons about my pale complexion or weight loss were reminders that my lifestyle was taking a visible toll on my health, but medical checkups were luxuries I couldn't justify when the money could be better spent on publishing expenses. The invitation to the annual Richardson family 4th of July barbecue arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday evening in mid-June, handwritten on Aunt Diane's characteristic lavender stationery with her perfectly formed cursive loops. The event had been a family tradition for over 20 years, hosted alternately by different relatives but always featuring the same combination of grilled hamburgers, potato salad competitions, and Uncle Marcus holding court with his opinions about everything from local politics to professional sports. This year's gathering was being held at my cousin Trevor's new house in Greenfield Township, a suburban development about 40 minutes from Millbrook where the houses were large, the lawns were meticulously maintained, and the homeowners association had strict rules about everything from mailbox colors to acceptable window treatments. Trevor worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company and had recently married Stephanie, a dental hygienist who seemed to view family gatherings as opportunities to showcase her domestic skills and social status. The invitation itself seemed routine, but something about the timing struck me as unusual. Previous year's barbecues had been planned well in advance, with invitations arriving in early May to allow family members time to arrange their schedules around the holiday weekend. This year's late invitation meant I had less than 3 weeks' notice, which was particularly inconvenient because I had already planned to spend the long weekend working on a particularly challenging chapter of my 4th novel. When I called Trevor to confirm my attendance, his response was oddly formal and brief. Instead of the typical family small talk about work, weather, and local gossip, he simply confirmed the date, time, and address before ending the conversation abruptly. Trevor had always been friendly and talkative during our previous interactions, often asking detailed questions about my writing progress and expressing genuine interest in my publishing journey. His sudden coolness was puzzling but not alarming enough to warrant serious concern. The second unusual sign appeared during my weekly phone call with my father. Robert Richardson was not typically someone who paid attention to family social dynamics or gossiped about relatives, preferring to focus conversations on practical matters like home maintenance, local news, and his part-time job at the hardware store. However, during our conversation 2 weeks before the barbecue, he mentioned that Uncle Marcus had been asking questions about my writing career with what seemed like unusual frequency and intensity. According to my father, Marcus had called him 3 times in the past month, ostensibly to discuss other family matters but inevitably steering the conversations toward my publishing efforts. The questions were detailed and specific. How many copies of my books had I sold? What was my actual income from writing? Had I received any significant recognition from publishers or literary organizations? Was I still living in the studio apartment above the hardware store? My father, who had never shown much interest in the business aspects of my writing career, was puzzled by his brother's sudden curiosity about my financial situation. He relayed these conversations to me with a tone that suggested he found Marcus's inquiries inappropriate but wasn't sure how to interpret them. The questioning felt invasive and slightly predatory, like Marcus was gathering intelligence for some unspecified purpose. The third warning sign emerged during a routine visit to the library where I worked. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, who had been my supervisor for 6 years, mentioned that she had received a strange phone call the previous week from someone identifying himself as my uncle. The caller had asked detailed questions about my work schedule, my job performance, and whether I had expressed any intentions of leaving my position at the library. Mrs. Henderson, who was fiercely protective of her staff's privacy, had refused to provide any specific information about my employment situation. However, she was curious enough about the call to ask me whether I was aware that family members were making inquiries about my professional life. The fact that Uncle Marcus was conducting what amounted to a background investigation of my career struck me as deeply inappropriate and vaguely threatening. When I confronted my father about Marcus's phone call to my workplace, his response was defensive and evasive. He claimed that Marcus was simply concerned about my welfare and wanted to ensure that I was financially stable. This explanation might have been plausible if Marcus had ever previously expressed concern about my well-being, but his track record of criticism and discouragement made his sudden interest in my job security seem suspicious rather than caring. The fourth anomaly occurred during my monthly grocery shopping trip to the Savimart in neighboring Millfield. While loading canned goods into my cart, I encountered my cousin Bradley, who was typically friendly and talkative during our infrequent encounters. Instead of his usual enthusiastic greeting and inquiries about my writing progress, Bradley seemed nervous and avoided making direct eye contact. When I asked about his construction work and his family, Bradley's responses were monosyllabic and distracted. He kept glancing around the store as if he was worried about being seen talking to me, and he made an excuse to leave the conversation after less than 2 minutes. This behavior was completely out of character for Bradley, who normally would spend 15 or 20 minutes catching up on family news and sharing stories about his various projects and adventures. The encounter left me feeling unsettled and confused. Bradley had never treated me with anything other than warmth and respect, even during periods when he was asking to borrow money or seeking advice about his romantic relationships. His sudden discomfort in my presence suggested that something had changed in the family dynamic, but I couldn't identify what might have caused such a shift. 2 days later, I received an unexpected visit from my Aunt Dorothy at the library. Dorothy rarely came to Millbrook, preferring to conduct family business through phone calls and occasional gatherings at other relatives' homes. Her appearance during my work hours was unprecedented and immediately raised my alert level. Dorothy's demeanor during the visit was awkward and strained, quite different from her usual confident and slightly manipulative approach to family interactions. She spent several minutes browsing through the fiction section, occasionally glancing in my direction but avoiding direct conversation. When she finally approached my desk, Her questions were oddly superficial and seemed designed to fill time rather than gather information or accomplish any specific goal. After 10 minutes of uncomfortable small talk about library policies and local weather patterns, Dorothy abruptly shifted the conversation to my writing career. Her questions echoed the same themes that my father had reported from Uncle Marcus's inquiries: sales figures, income levels, and future career prospects. However, Dorothy's approach was more direct and aggressive than Marcus's indirect method of questioning other family members. She asked whether I had considered abandoning my writing career in favor of pursuing more traditional employment opportunities. When I explained that writing remained my primary professional focus, Dorothy's expression became disapproving and slightly hostile. She made pointed comments about women my age who had established careers in healthcare, education, or business, always emphasizing their financial security and social respectability. The conversation concluded with Dorothy making vague references to upcoming family discussions about my future and suggesting that I should be prepared to make some serious decisions about my life direction. Her comments were ambiguous enough to avoid constituting direct threats, but the implication was clear: some kind of family intervention or confrontation was being planned. The most unsettling warning sign appeared during my final pre-barbecue encounter with family members. While picking up prescriptions at Millbrook Pharmacy, I overheard a conversation between two women in the next aisle who were discussing someone they referred to only as "that Richardson girl who thinks she's a writer." Their comments were loud enough to be clearly audible and detailed enough to obviously refer to me. The women, whom I eventually identified as Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Cole from the Methodist church that several of my relatives attended, were engaged in a detailed critique of my career choices and lifestyle. They discussed my living situation, my financial struggles, my lack of romantic relationships, and my stubborn refusal to accept family advice about pursuing more practical employment. Their information was accurate and specific enough to indicate that they had received detailed reports from family members. More disturbing than the gossip itself was the tone of the conversation, which suggested that my personal and professional choices had become a source of community entertainment and disapproval. The women spoke about me as if I was a cautionary tale or a source of family embarrassment rather than a person deserving basic respect and privacy. Their comments revealed that my extended family had been sharing intimate details about my life with outside parties, violating boundaries of confidentiality that I had assumed were understood and respected. The pharmacy incident made me realize that the upcoming barbecue was likely to be more than a routine family gathering. The pattern of unusual inquiries, awkward encounters, and community gossip suggested that some kind of orchestrated confrontation was being planned. Uncle Marcus appeared to be the orchestrator, gathering intelligence and building support for what seemed like an intervention designed to pressure me into abandoning my writing career. Despite recognizing these warning signs, I couldn't have imagined the extent to which my family was prepared to humiliate and betray me. The evidence suggested tension and disapproval, but I interpreted these signs as typical family dysfunction rather than indicators of the devastating ambush that awaited me at Trevor's barbecue. My decision to attend the gathering despite the mounting red flags reflected both my naive faith in family loyalty and my stubborn determination not to be intimidated by passive-aggressive manipulation. I convinced myself that facing whatever confrontation was being planned would be preferable to giving my critics the satisfaction of thinking they had successfully driven me away from family events. In preparation for the barbecue, I made strategic decisions about how to handle potential conflicts. I brought copies of my 3 published novels, thinking that tangible evidence of my achievements might help counter criticism about my lack of progress. I also prepared mental talking points about positive reviews, growing readership, and future publishing plans, hoping to demonstrate that my career was developing successfully despite the financial challenges. The most significant miscalculation in my preparation was underestimating Uncle Marcus's willingness to engage in public humiliation rather than private confrontation. I had expected criticism, arguments, and pressure to reconsider my career choices, but I had not anticipated that he would use the family gathering as a stage for a deliberate and calculated attack on my dignity and self-respect. Looking back, the warning signs were clear and abundant. Family members had been gathering information about my personal and professional life for weeks, conducting what amounted to surveillance of my activities and preparing talking points for a coordinated assault on my choices. The community gossip indicated that my private struggles had been shared widely enough to become public entertainment, setting the stage for a humiliation that would extend far beyond the immediate family circle. The late invitation, the nervous behavior of family members, the inappropriate inquiries about my employment, and the overheard gossip all pointed toward a planned confrontation. However, none of these signs prepared me for the viciousness and cruelty of Uncle Marcus's attack, or for the complicity of other family members who watched my humiliation without offering support or intervention. The barbecue invitation that had seemed like a routine family obligation had actually been an invitation to my own execution, planned and orchestrated by people who claimed to love me but were apparently more concerned with their own embarrassment about my unconventional choices than with my emotional well-being. The warning signs had been there, but I had been too trusting and too invested in family relationships to recognize them as preparation for betrayal. The drive to Trevor's house on 4th of July morning should have been filled with anticipation. Foreseeing family members I hadn't encountered in months, but instead I found myself gripping the steering wheel with sweaty palms and rehearsing potential responses to criticism about my career choices. The GPS directed me through increasingly affluent neighborhoods where the houses grew larger and the driveways displayed expensive SUVs and luxury sedans that made my aging Ford Focus seem even more shabby by comparison. Trevor's subdivision, Meadowbrook Estates, featured an imposing brick entrance with ornate iron gates and professionally landscaped gardens that screamed new money and social aspiration. The houses were massive colonial-style structures with perfectly manicured lawns, elaborate flower beds, and driveways that could accommodate 4 or 5 vehicles. Each home seemed designed to communicate its owner's financial success and social status to anyone who might be observing or judging. Finding Trevor's address required navigating a maze of curved streets with names like Prosperity Lane and Heritage Circle, all lined with identical mailboxes and houses that differed only in minor architectural details and color schemes. When I finally located the correct address, I sat in my car for several minutes, gathering courage to face whatever confrontation awaited me inside. The house itself was imposing and intimidating, a 2-story brick structure with white columns, elaborate trim work, and a 3-car garage that was larger than many entire apartments. The front lawn was so perfectly maintained that it looked artificial, without a single weed or bare spot visible anywhere in the emerald green expanse. Decorative flags featuring patriotic themes fluttered from poles positioned strategically around the property, creating an atmosphere of suburban perfection that felt almost aggressive in its completeness. Multiple vehicles were already parked in the driveway and along the street, indicating that most family members had arrived before me. I recognized Uncle Marcus's black Cadillac, Aunt Dorothy's silver Mercedes, and several other cars belonging to cousins and their spouses. The impressive lineup of expensive vehicles made my Ford Focus look like a charity case, reinforcing the message that I was the family's financial failure. Walking toward the front door, I could hear laughter and conversation drifting from the backyard where the barbecue was already in progress. The sounds were festive and cheerful, creating a false sense of normalcy that contrasted sharply with my growing anxiety about the reception I would receive. I rang the doorbell and waited, clutching the canvas bag containing copies of my 3 novels that I had brought as evidence of my publishing achievements. Stephanie answered the door wearing a perfectly coordinated outfit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her smile was bright but seemed forced, and her greeting was polite but lacked the warmth I had expected from a family member I hadn't seen in over a year. She complimented my dress, a thrift store find that I had selected carefully for the occasion, but her tone carried a subtle condescension that made the compliment feel like an insult. The interior of the house was a showcase of expensive furniture, elaborate decorations, and technological amenities that demonstrated Trevor and Stephanie's prosperity. The living room featured a massive flat-screen television, leather furniture arranged with magazine-worthy precision, and artwork that looked professionally selected rather than personally meaningful. Every surface was perfectly clean and uncluttered, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a furniture showroom than a family home. Stephanie led me through the house toward the backyard, making small talk about the weather and the challenges of hosting large family gatherings. Her conversation was pleasant but superficial, avoiding any mention of my writing career or personal life. This omission felt deliberate and ominous, suggesting that she had been instructed to avoid topics that might trigger premature discussion of controversial subjects. The backyard was an extension of the house's theme of expensive perfection. A large wooden deck featured outdoor furniture that looked like it belonged in a high-end resort, surrounding a built-in grill that was clearly designed for serious entertaining. The swimming pool was kidney-shaped with decorative tile work and a small waterfall feature that added to the overall impression of suburban luxury. Perfectly maintained flower beds bordered the property, creating a park-like setting that must have required professional landscaping services. Most of the family was already gathered around the deck and pool area, engaged in the typical barbecue activities of eating, drinking, and catching up on family news. At first glance, the scene appeared normal and festive, with children playing in the pool while adults clustered in small groups discussing work, local politics, and shared memories. However, as I approached the gathering, I noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere that confirmed my suspicions about the day's true agenda. Conversations quieted noticeably when family members noticed my arrival, and several people avoided making direct eye contact with me. The typical enthusiastic greetings and questions about my life were replaced by polite but distant acknowledgments of my presence. Even family members who had always been warm and supportive seemed uncomfortable and evasive, suggesting that they were aware of whatever confrontation was being planned. Uncle Marcus was holding court near the grill, wearing an expensive polo shirt and speaking loudly about his recent business successes and vacation travels. He noticed my arrival immediately but continued his story without acknowledging my presence, a deliberate snub that was clearly intended to communicate his disapproval. His body language was confident and aggressive, like a predator preparing to strike at the optimal moment. I found a relatively quiet spot near the pool and attempted to engage in normal family conversation with my cousin Janet, who had always been friendly and supportive of my writing efforts. However, Janet seemed nervous and distracted, giving brief responses to my questions and glancing frequently toward Uncle Marcus as if waiting for some kind of signal or cue. The first hour of the barbecue proceeded with an undercurrent of tension that made normal socializing difficult and uncomfortable. Family members seemed to be waiting for something to happen, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that reminded me of the moments before a thunderstorm when the air becomes heavy and electric. I attempted to distribute copies of my novels to relatives who had expressed interest in my writing, but these gifts were received with polite but unenthusiastic acknowledgments. Trevor, who had always been one of my strongest family supporters, seemed particularly uncomfortable during our brief conversation about my recent publishing activities. He asked perfunctory questions about my books but seemed distracted and kept glancing toward his wife and Uncle Marcus as if seeking approval for his interactions with me. His behavior was completely out of character and confirmed that some kind of family meeting or discussion had occurred prior to my arrival. The confrontation began during the meal, when Uncle Marcus stood up from his chair and requested everyone's attention for what he described as an important family announcement. The casual conversation stopped immediately, and all eyes turned toward him with an expectancy that suggested this moment had been anticipated and planned. My stomach dropped as I realized that I was about to become the subject of whatever pronouncement he was preparing to make. Marcus began by talking about family values, hard work, and the importance of making responsible life choices that contributed to both personal success and family reputation. His tone was serious and authoritative, like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. He spoke about the sacrifices that previous generations had made to build the family's reputation and stability, and the obligation that current family members had to honor those sacrifices through their own achievements and behavior. As his speech continued, it became increasingly clear that I was the target of his criticism. Without mentioning my name initially, he described a family member who had been indulging in fantasy instead of building a real career, who had been wasting education and opportunity on impractical dreams, and who had become a source of embarrassment and concern for relatives who cared about the family's standing in the community. The attack became more direct and personal as Marcus warmed to his theme. He criticized my living situation, my financial struggles, my lack of romantic relationships, and my stubborn refusal to accept family advice about pursuing more conventional employment. His information was detailed and accurate, confirming that family members had been sharing intimate details about my personal life with him and possibly with others outside the family. When he finally mentioned my writing career directly, his tone became openly contemptuous and mocking. He referred to my novels as vanity publishing and suggested that self-publishing was nothing more than an expensive hobby that allowed delusional people to pretend they were real authors. He claimed that my sales figures proved that nobody was interested in reading my stories, and that continuing to pursue writing was evidence of mental instability or stubborn pride. The most devastating moment came when Marcus reached into a bag beside his chair and pulled out a copy of my latest novel, The Weight of Wings. He held it up for everyone to see, his expression displaying disgust and contempt that was visible from across the entire gathering. The sight of my book in his hands filled me with dread because I could sense that he was preparing to do something cruel and calculated with it. Marcus began reading selected passages from my novel aloud, but he delivered them in a mocking, exaggerated tone that made my carefully crafted prose sound ridiculous and pretentious. He chose sections that dealt with the protagonist's dreams and aspirations, rendering them as objects of ridicule rather than sources of inspiration. His performance was designed to humiliate me and demonstrate that my writing was worthless and laughable. The family's reaction to Marcus's performance was the most painful aspect of the entire ordeal. Instead of defending me or objecting to his cruelty, most relatives laughed along with his mockery or watched in uncomfortable silence. Even family members who had previously expressed support for my writing seemed unwilling to challenge Marcus's authority or risk becoming targets of his criticism themselves. After finishing his dramatic reading, Marcus delivered the statement that would haunt me for months afterward. He declared that my writing was absolute toilet paper, that had no value or merit, and that I had been wasting 7 years of my life on something that would never amount to anything meaningful. His words were chosen deliberately to inflict maximum emotional damage, attacking not just my current efforts but my entire adult identity and purpose. The physical destruction of my book was the climax of Marcus's calculated assault. He walked over to the barbecue grill, where hot coals were still glowing from the meal preparation, and held my novel over the flames. He made a show of dropping the book onto the coals, where it immediately began to burn and curl, the pages blackening and disintegrating while family members watched in fascination or horror. As my book burned, Marcus delivered his final verdict: I needed to abandon my childish fantasies and start building a real career that would contribute to my own financial security and the family's reputation. He suggested that my continued pursuit of writing was selfish and irresponsible, particularly given my age and lack of dependence. His tone was that of someone delivering an ultimatum rather than offering advice or expressing concern. The silence that followed Marcus's performance was deafening and oppressive. Nobody spoke in my defense or challenged his right to destroy my property and attack my life choices in such a public and humiliating manner. The family members who had always claimed to support my dreams sat quietly, avoiding eye contact and apparently hoping that the confrontation would end quickly so they could return to more comfortable topics of conversation. My initial response to the attack was complete shock and disbelief. I had expected criticism and pressure to reconsider my career choices, but the viciousness and premeditated nature of Marcus's assault exceeded anything I had imagined possible from a family member. The public setting and the complicity of other relatives transformed the experience from a family disagreement into a devastating betrayal that would fundamentally alter my relationships with everyone present. The most crushing realization was that this confrontation had been planned and orchestrated, with the knowledge and consent of multiple family members. The warning signs I had noticed over the previous weeks now made perfect sense. Marcus had been gathering intelligence about my personal and professional life in order to plan this attack more effectively. The late invitation, the awkward encounters, and the community gossip had all been components of a deliberate campaign to isolate and humiliate me. As I sat there watching my book burn and listening to the satisfied murmur of family conversation resuming around me, I understood that I was experiencing a defining moment that would force me to choose between accepting this treatment and fighting back against it. The person I had been before that moment, trusting, accommodating, and desperate for family approval, was dying along with the pages curling in the flames. The transformation that occurred within me as I watched my book burn was unlike anything I had experienced in my 29 years of life. The shock and devastation of Uncle Marcus's attack crystallized into something harder and more dangerous, a cold fury that burned away years of people-pleasing and desperate family loyalty. I stood up from my chair with a steadiness that surprised me, my voice cutting through the resumed chatter of family members who thought the entertainment was over. That book you just burned, I said, my words carrying across the deck with perfect clarity, represented 3 years of work. 3 years of waking up at 5 a.m. to write before my library shifts. 3 years of research, revision, and professional editing that cost me $4,000 I saved by eating ramen noodles and wearing thrift store clothes. The conversation stopped again as family members realized that I wasn't going to accept Marcus's humiliation quietly and retreat like a wounded animal. Uncle Marcus turned toward me with an expression of surprise and annoyance, clearly not having anticipated that I would respond publicly to his attack. His confidence wavered slightly as he recognized that the dynamic had shifted and I was no longer playing the role of helpless victim. That book has 47 5-star reviews on Amazon from readers who wrote detailed comments about how the story helped them process their own family relationships and personal struggles. It has been featured in 3 literary blogs and recommended by 2 independent bookstore owners in Pennsylvania and Ohio. But you didn't research any of that before you decided to burn it, did you, Marcus? My uncle's face began to redden as he realized that I had documentation to counter his claims about my work being worthless and unread. He opened his mouth to respond, but I continued speaking before he could regain control of the conversation. You spent weeks investigating my personal life, calling my employer, questioning family members about my finances, and spreading gossip about my career choices throughout the community. You violated my privacy, betrayed my trust, and turned my personal struggles into public entertainment. And then you had the audacity to invite me here so you could humiliate me in front of the entire family. Trevor stepped forward nervously, trying to defuse the confrontation that was escalating beyond his comfort level. Penelope, maybe we should all calm down and discuss this privately. This is supposed to be a family celebration, not a place for arguments. I turned toward my cousin with a look that made him step backward involuntarily. Trevor, did you know what Uncle Marcus was planning when you invited me here? Did you know he was going to destroy my property and attack my career in front of everyone? Because if you did know, then you're not an innocent bystander trying to keep the peace. You're a co-conspirator who helped orchestrate this ambush. Trevor's uncomfortable silence and refusal to make eye contact provided the answer to my question. His complicity was confirmed by his inability to deny advance knowledge of Marcus's plans. The realization that my cousin had been part of the conspiracy to humiliate me added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. Aunt Dorothy chose that moment to insert herself into the confrontation, adopting the condescending tone she typically used when dispensing unsolicited life advice. "Penelope, honey, we're all just concerned about your future. You're almost 30 years old, and you're still living like a college student. We want to see you succeed, but this writing hobby isn't providing the stability you need." The word hobby triggered something primal in my response. Hobby? Dorothy, I've published 3 novels, built a readership across multiple states, and earned recognition from literary professionals. How exactly is that different from any other entrepreneurial endeavor? When Trevor was building his pharmaceutical sales career, did anyone call it a hobby because his income was modest during the first few years? My comparison to Trevor's career trajectory was strategically chosen to highlight the double standard being applied to my professional efforts. Family members had been patient and supportive during Trevor's early career struggles, but they were unwilling to extend the same consideration to my creative pursuits simply because they didn't understand or value the publishing industry. Uncle Marcus attempted to regain control of the situation by raising his voice and adopting an authoritative tone. The difference, Penelope, is that Trevor was building something real with genuine income potential. You're chasing a fantasy that keeps you trapped in poverty while the rest of us worry about your welfare. It's time for someone to tell you the hard truth about your situation. My response came without hesitation or diplomacy. The hard truth, Marcus, is that you know nothing about the publishing industry, nothing about my actual sales figures or income potential, and nothing about the professional relationships I've built over 7 years of dedicated work. You've decided that my career is worthless based on your ignorance and prejudice, not on any factual analysis of my prospects or achievements. The accusation of ignorance struck home, and Marcus's expression became openly hostile. "Don't you dare lecture me about success, young lady. I've built $1 million insurance business while you've been playing pretend in your little apartment above a hardware store. I know what real achievement looks like, and it doesn't involve vanity. Publishing books that nobody reads." This attack on my living situation and publishing method revealed the depth of Marcus's research into my personal circumstances, but it also provided me with an opportunity to expose his hypocrisy and cruelty. "You're right that I live modestly while pursuing my goals. But at least I'm not so insecure about my own achievements that I need to destroy other people's dreams to feel superior. What kind of successful person needs to burn books to prove his worth?" The reference to book burning carried historical weight that made several family members visibly uncomfortable. My deliberate choice of that phrase was intended to highlight the barbaric nature of Marcus's actions and force witnesses to confront the ugliness of what they had allowed to happen. Stephanie, who had been watching the confrontation with growing anxiety about its impact on her perfectly orchestrated gathering, attempted to redirect the conversation toward reconciliation. "Maybe we can all agree to disagree about career choices and just enjoy the rest of the afternoon together. There's no need for this discussion to ruin the entire barbecue." Her suggestion that we should simply ignore what had happened revealed the family's typical approach to conflict: sweep problems under the rug and pretend that serious violations of respect and dignity were minor disagreements that could be resolved through forced pleasantness. This attitude had probably enabled Marcus's behavior for years by refusing to hold him accountable for his treatment of other family members. "Stephanie, there's no agreeing to disagree about destroying someone's property and publicly humiliating them at a family gathering. What happened here today isn't a difference of opinion about career choices. It's deliberate cruelty designed to force me to abandon my dreams through shame and intimidation." My refusal to participate in the family's conflict avoidance strategy created visible tension among relatives who had expected me to eventually back down and accept Marcus's authority. Their discomfort intensified as they realized that I was demanding accountability rather than seeking reconciliation on terms that would allow everyone to maintain their comfortable illusions about family dynamics. Cousin Janet finally spoke up, her voice tentative but supportive. "Penelope's right that burning her book was wrong. I've read her novels, and they're actually quite good. Maybe we should apologize and try to understand her perspective better." This small gesture of support from Janet created a crack in the wall of family solidarity that had enabled Marcus's attack. However, her suggestion that an apology might resolve the situation demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the magnitude of what had occurred. Simple apologies couldn't repair the trust that had been shattered or undo the deliberate cruelty that had been displayed. Uncle Marcus responded to Janet's mild criticism with the full force of his authoritarian personality. Don't enable her. Delusions, Janet. Penelope needs to face reality, not receive more encouragement for behavior that's keeping her trapped in failure. Sometimes tough love requires saying things that people don't want to hear. His characterization of book burning and public humiliation as tough love revealed the twisted logic he used to justify his cruelty. This perspective painted him as a caring family member making difficult but necessary interventions, rather than an insecure bully attacking someone he perceived as vulnerable. My response to this rationalization was swift and uncompromising. Tough love involves honest conversations about genuine concerns, Marcus. What you did today was calculated harassment designed to shame me into abandoning my career. There's nothing loving about destroying someone's work, nothing tough about attacking someone who can't fight back on equal terms, and nothing helpful about trying to crush someone's dreams through public humiliation. The precision of my counterattack seemed to surprise family members who had never seen me respond aggressively to criticism or defend myself with such intensity. Years of accepting their condescension and doubt had created an expectation that I would always be passive and accommodating, even when faced with outrageous treatment. The confrontation reached its climax when I pulled out my phone and began taking photographs of the burned remains of my book in the barbecue grill. Family members immediately became alarmed about the documentation of what had occurred, recognizing that photographic evidence could be used to hold them accountable for their actions beyond the immediate family circle. What are you doing? Stephanie asked nervously, clearly worried about the implications of having permanent evidence of the incident. I'm documenting what happened here today, I replied calmly while continuing to photograph the scene. Uncle Marcus destroyed my property in front of witnesses, and I'm making sure there's a permanent record of his actions. These photos will be very useful when I discuss this incident with other family members who weren't present, as well as with friends and colleagues who need to understand why I'm reevaluating my relationships with certain relatives. The threat of broader exposure created immediate panic among family members who realized that their complicity in the day's events could become widely known outside their immediate circle. The prospect of being held accountable by their broader social networks for enabling book burning and public humiliation was clearly more frightening to them than the impact of their actions on my emotional well-being. Uncle Marcus made one final attempt to assert his authority and end the confrontation on his terms. Put that phone away, Penelope. What happens in this family stays in this family. We don't air our dirty laundry in public, and we don't document private conversations to use against each other later. His demand that I comply with family rules about privacy and loyalty revealed the hypocrisy at the heart of his position. He felt entitled to violate my privacy, destroy my property, and attack my character in front of the entire extended family. But he expected me to protect his reputation by keeping quiet about his actions. My response was delivered with ice-cold clarity. Marcus, you forfeited any right to family loyalty and privacy protection when you turned my personal struggles into public entertainment. You chose to make this a public spectacle, so you don't get to control how that spectacle is remembered or discussed. These photos stay with me, and I'll use them however I see fit. With that declaration, I gathered my purse and the remaining copies of my novels, walking toward the gate that led to the front yard where my car was parked. The silence that followed my departure was heavy with tension and unresolved conflict, but it was no longer my responsibility to manage other people's discomfort with the consequences of their actions. As I reached my car, I turned back toward the house one final time and spoke loudly enough for everyone on the deck to hear clearly. For 7 years, I've worked to build something meaningful while accepting your criticism and doubt because I believed family relationships were worth preserving despite fundamental disagreements. Today you taught me that some relationships aren't worth preserving when they require accepting abuse as the price of belonging. Thank you for that lesson. The drive home was surreal, my hands shaking slightly as I navigated the winding streets of Meadowbrook Estates while processing what had just occurred. The person who had arrived at that barbecue anxious about family approval was gone forever, replaced by someone who refused to accept mistreatment regardless of its source or social cost. The first thing I did after arriving home was sit in my car in the hardware store parking lot for 20 minutes, not ready to face the familiar confines of my studio apartment where I had spent 7 years building dreams that my family had just tried to incinerate along with my book. My hands had stopped shaking, but my mind was racing with possibilities and plans that felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. The person who had driven to that barbecue seeking family approval was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real validation would have to come from outside the suffocating circle of relatives who mistook cruelty for concern. When I finally climbed the creaking stairs to my apartment, the space looked different somehow, as if my confrontation with Uncle Marcus had shifted my perspective on everything I thought I knew about my life and circumstances. The cramped quarters that had felt like temporary sacrifice now seemed like evidence of determination and focus. The second-hand furniture and carefully managed budget that had embarrassed me in family conversations now appeared as proof that I was willing to prioritize meaningful goals over social appearances. The first strategic decision I made was to document everything that had occurred at the barbecue while the details were still fresh and emotionally immediate. I opened my laptop and began writing a detailed account of Uncle Marcus's behavior, the family's complicity, and my response to their coordinated attack. The process of converting the day's trauma into precise written narrative was both therapeutic and empowering, transforming me from victim to chronicler of injustice. As I wrote, I realized that the barbecue incident was part of a larger pattern of family dysfunction that I had been too close to recognize clearly. Uncle Marcus's need to destroy other people's achievements to feel superior, the family's willingness to enable his behavior through silence and complicity, and their collective investment in maintaining social appearances rather than supporting individual dreams and aspirations. Writing about these dynamics helped me understand that what had happened wasn't really about my writing career, it was about power, control, and the enforcement of conformity within family hierarchies. The second action I took was researching legal options for addressing the destruction of my property. While a single paperback book wasn't financially significant, the deliberate destruction of my intellectual property in front of witnesses might constitute harassment or intentional infliction of emotional distress. More importantly, consulting with legal professionals would send a clear message to my family that I was serious about holding them accountable for their actions and wouldn't be intimidated into accepting abuse quietly. I contacted Jennifer Walsh, a lawyer I had met through library programming who specialized in intellectual property and small business issues. Jennifer had attended several of my author readings and had expressed genuine interest in my publishing journey. When I called her office on Monday morning and explained the situation, she immediately agreed to meet with me to discuss potential legal remedies and protective measures. The consultation with Jennifer was illuminating and empowering. She explained that while the monetary value of the destroyed book was minimal, the deliberate destruction of an author's work in front of witnesses could potentially constitute harassment, especially given the pattern of invasive inquiries and community gossip that had preceded the incident. More significantly, she helped me understand my rights regarding privacy violations and defamation, issues that became relevant given Uncle Marcus's campaign of gathering and spreading information about my personal life. Jennifer also introduced me to concepts I hadn't previously considered, such as restraining orders and cease and desist letters that could prevent further harassment or privacy violations. While I wasn't ready to pursue formal legal action immediately, having professional guidance about my options created a sense of empowerment and control that had been missing from my life for years. For the first time since beginning my writing career, I felt like I had allies and resources rather than facing challenges completely alone. The third decisive action involved reaching out to my literary network, a community of writers, editors, and publishing professionals that I had been building slowly over 7 years of conference attendance, online interactions, and collaborative projects. These relationships represented genuine professional connections based on mutual respect and shared creative goals, quite different from the family relationships that were based on obligation, proximity, and increasingly toxic dynamics. My first call was to Sarah Chen, the freelance editor who had worked on all 3 of my novels and had become both a professional mentor and personal friend. Sarah listened to my account of the barbecue incident with growing outrage and immediately offered both practical support and emotional validation. She confirmed that my writing was professionally competent and commercially viable, countering Uncle Marcus's claims about my work being worthless hobby activity. More importantly, Sarah connected me with other authors who had faced similar family challenges during their early career development. She arranged a conference call with 3 writers who had overcome family disapproval, financial struggles, and social isolation to build successful publishing careers. These conversations provided perspective, encouragement, and practical advice about managing the emotional and professional challenges of pursuing creative careers without family support. The fourth action was strategic and somewhat vindictive, but it felt necessary for establishing boundaries and consequences. I decided to share the photographic evidence of my burned book and my written account of the barbecue incident with carefully selected family members who hadn't been present but needed to understand what had occurred. This wasn't gossip or revenge, it was documentation and transparency designed to prevent Uncle Marcus from controlling the narrative about what had happened. I sent detailed emails to my father, my mother in Florida, and several aunts and uncles who had previously expressed support for my writing efforts. Each email included the photographs of my burned book, a factual account of the incident, and a clear explanation of why I was sharing this information. I emphasized that I wasn't seeking to create family drama but needed extended family members to understand why my relationships with certain relatives would be changing permanently. The responses to these emails were revealing and helped me identify family members who were genuinely supportive versus those who prioritized family harmony over individual dignity and respect. My father's response was disappointing but not surprising. He minimized the significance of Marcus's behavior and suggested that I was overreacting to what he characterized as a family disagreement. His loyalty to his brother was stronger than his support for his daughter's dreams and well-being, however. My mother's response was surprisingly supportive and validating. Despite our complicated relationship history, she recognized the cruelty and premeditation involved in Marcus's attack and expressed genuine outrage about the family's complicity. She offered to speak with other family members on my behalf and suggested that I consider limiting contact with relatives who had participated in or enabled the harassment. My Aunt Louise, my father's sister who lived in California and rarely attended family gatherings, provided the most insightful response. She revealed that Uncle Marcus had engaged in similar behavior toward other family members over the years, using public humiliation and social pressure to enforce his opinions about appropriate life choices. Her email included specific examples of Marcus's previous attacks on relatives who had pursued unconventional careers, non-traditional relationships, or lifestyle choices that conflicted with his narrow definitions of success and respectability. This information from Aunt Louise reframed the barbecue incident as part of a broader pattern of abusive behavior that had been tolerated and enabled by family members for decades. Understanding that I wasn't Marcus's first target helped reduce the personal sting of his attack while also clarifying that confronting his behavior was important not just for my own well-being but potentially for protecting other family members from similar treatment. The fifth strategic action involved expanding and strengthening my professional and social networks outside the family system. I realized that my isolation and dependence on family approval had made me vulnerable to their manipulation and control. Building genuine relationships with people who shared my values and supported my goals would provide the emotional and practical support that my family had never offered consistently. I began attending more literary events, joining professional organizations for independent authors, and participating in online communities where writers supported each other's careers and celebrated each other's achievements. These activities required time and energy that I had previously devoted to managing family relationships and seeking their approval, but the return on investment was dramatically different and more positive. Within 2 weeks of the barbecue incident, I had connected with a local authors group that met monthly to discuss marketing strategies, share resources, and provide mutual support for independent publishing efforts. The members included several writers who had achieved significant commercial success through self-publishing, demonstrating that Uncle Marcus's claims about vanity publishing being worthless were factually incorrect and based on outdated prejudices. The sixth action was perhaps the most important for my long-term well-being. I began working with Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a therapist who specialized in family trauma and creative career development. Dr. Rodriguez helped me process the emotional impact of the barbecue incident while also examining the broader patterns of family dysfunction that had shaped my relationships and self-perception for years. Through therapy, I began to understand how my desperate need for family approval had distorted my decision-making and limited my potential for genuine happiness and success. Dr. Rodriguez helped me recognize that the sacrifices I had made to pursue writing were admirable and demonstrated remarkable dedication, but the sacrifices I had made to maintain toxic family relationships were unnecessary and ultimately self-destructive. The therapeutic process also helped me develop healthier boundaries and communication strategies for dealing with family members who continued to contact me after the barbecue incident. Several relatives attempted to minimize what had happened or pressure me to apologize to Uncle Marcus for my disrespectful response to his attack. Dr. Rodriguez provided me with language and techniques for responding to these manipulation attempts without becoming drawn back into dysfunctional family dynamics. By the end of July, less than a month after the barbecue incident, my life had been fundamentally transformed. The family relationships that had dominated my emotional landscape for 29 years were no longer central to my sense of identity and self-worth. I had built a support network of professional colleagues, creative peers, and mental health resources that provided genuine encouragement and practical assistance for achieving my goals. Most importantly, I had discovered a strength and assertiveness that had been dormant during years of accommodating family criticism and seeking approval from people who were incapable of providing it. The woman who had arrived at Trevor's barbecue, desperate for acceptance, was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real success meant pursuing meaningful goals with integrity and courage. regardless of whether family members understood or approved of those choices. The changes in my daily routine reflected this psychological transformation. Instead of spending evenings worrying about family disapproval or crafting explanations for my lifestyle choices, I focused entirely on writing, marketing, and building professional relationships that supported my career development. The mental energy that had been consumed by family drama was redirected toward productive activities that moved me closer to my publishing goals. I also made practical changes to protect myself from further harassment or manipulation. I blocked Uncle Marcus's phone number and social media accounts, informed my workplace about potential inappropriate contact from family members, and established clear boundaries about which relatives were welcome to visit my apartment or attend my public author events. These protective measures weren't motivated by revenge or spite, but by a realistic assessment of which relationships were healthy and supportive versus which ones were toxic and destructive. The barbecue incident had provided clarity about people's true characters and priorities, information that I used to make strategic decisions about where to invest my time, energy, and emotional resources moving forward. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 3 months and 18 days after Uncle Marcus had burned my book at the barbecue. I was in the middle of cataloging new arrivals at the library when Mrs. Henderson approached my desk with an expression of barely contained excitement, holding the landline phone with her hand covering the mouthpiece. "Penelope, there's someone on the phone who says she's calling from Harpo Productions. She's asking to speak with you about your novels." Mrs. Henderson's voice was whisper quiet, but her eyes were wide with anticipation. Harpo Productions meant only one thing in the literary world, and both of us understood the magnitude of what this phone call might represent. My hands were trembling as I took the receiver, and my voice sounded unnaturally high when I answered. The woman on the other end identified herself as Rebecca Martinez, a senior producer for Oprah's book club, and she spoke with the kind of professional warmth that immediately put me at ease while also making my heart race with possibilities I had never dared to imagine. "Ms. Richardson, I'm calling because Oprah has read all 3 of your novels, and she would like to discuss featuring your work on her book club platform. Are you available to speak with her directly this afternoon?" The words seemed surreal, like something from a dream that was too perfect to be real. I managed to confirm my availability while taking notes with a pen that kept slipping in my sweaty fingers. The backstory of how my books had reached Oprah emerged during our conversation. Dr. Angela Washington, a literature professor at Northwestern University who served as one of Oprah's reading advisors, had discovered my work through a chain of connections that traced back to Sarah Chen, my editor. Sarah had recommended my novels to a former colleague who worked with Dr. Washington on contemporary fiction reviews, and the professor had been impressed enough to pass my books along to Oprah's team for consideration. This revelation that my work had traveled through professional literary networks to reach one of the most influential voices in publishing felt like vindication of every strategic decision I had made over 7 years of building genuine industry relationships. While my family had dismissed my networking efforts as impractical socializing, those connections had ultimately created the pathway to the most significant opportunity of my career. Rebecca explained that Oprah had been particularly moved by The Weight of Wings, the historical fiction novel about a woman pursuing her dreams as a pilot despite family and societal opposition. The parallel themes of following personal passion despite external discouragement had resonated powerfully with Oprah's own experiences and her commitment to supporting stories about resilience and self-determination. Oprah described your writing as having authentic emotional intelligence and the rare ability to make readers examine their own relationships with family, dreams, and personal courage, Rebecca quoted. She's particularly interested in discussing how your personal experiences informed the themes in your novels, especially the dynamics of pursuing unconventional paths despite family resistance. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted by the universe. The same family conflicts that Uncle Marcus had used to attack my character and career choices were now being recognized as the source of authentic storytelling that had attracted the attention of the most successful media personality in America. The pain and isolation I had experienced were being transformed into professional validation and commercial opportunity. The actual conversation with Oprah took place that afternoon via video call from the library's conference room, which Mrs. Henderson had cleared and set up with professional lighting to ensure the best possible impression. When Oprah's face appeared on the screen, warm and engaging exactly as she appeared on television, I felt a surreal sense of stepping into an alternate reality where my dreams were not only possible but actively supported by someone with the power to make them come true. "Penelope, I have to tell you that your books moved me to tears," Oprah began, her voice carrying the same emotional authenticity that had made her a trusted figure for millions of readers. "The way you write about family relationships, about The courage it takes to pursue your authentic path when the people closest to you can't understand or support your vision, that speaks to something universal and deeply important. She went on to describe specific scenes from my novels that had resonated with her, demonstrating that she had read my work carefully and thoughtfully rather than simply reviewing summary reports from her staff. Her analysis of my character development and thematic consistency revealed a level of literary sophistication that countered every criticism my family had made about my writing being simplistic or commercially unviable. I want to feature The Weight of Wings as my next book club selection, Oprah continued, but I'm also interested in highlighting your entire body of work and your story as an author who persevered through significant challenges to build a meaningful career. Would you be willing to appear on my show to discuss your writing process and the personal experiences that shaped these stories? The opportunity she was offering extended far beyond a typical book club selection. She was proposing to feature my personal journey as an example of pursuing creative dreams despite opposition and financial hardship, exactly the narrative that my family had tried to shame me into abandoning. The validation was so complete and unexpected that I struggled to maintain professional composure during our conversation. We discussed logistics for the television appearance, marketing strategies for increasing my book's visibility, and potential collaboration opportunities for future projects. Oprah's team would handle the majority of promotional activities, but they wanted me to be prepared to speak authentically about the challenges I had faced as an independent author and the family dynamics that had informed my storytelling. The timeline for the book club announcement was aggressive. The selection would be announced in 2 weeks, with my television appearance scheduled for the following month. This schedule meant that within 6 weeks, my novels would be promoted to millions of readers through the most influential book recommendation platform in the world. The immediate aftermath of the phone call was a whirlwind of practical arrangements and emotional processing. Mrs. Henderson had been listening outside the conference room door and immediately requested permission to create a library display featuring my books and announcing the Oprah selection. The support from my workplace, which had always been professional and encouraging, now became actively promotional as the library recognized the prestige of having a staff member selected for such a significant honor. My first instinct was to share the news with family members, but I quickly realized that the people I most wanted to tell were no longer part of my active social circle. Instead, I called Sarah Chen, Dr. Rodriguez, and several members of my writers group, all of whom responded with genuine excitement and congratulations that felt far more meaningful than family approval would have been. The most satisfying conversation was with Jennifer Walsh, the lawyer who had helped me understand my options after the barbecue incident. Jennifer immediately recognized the professional vindication represented by Oprah's selection and suggested that this success would provide excellent leverage if any family members attempted to renew their harassment or criticism of my career choices. The news of my Oprah selection spread quickly through Millbrook's small social networks, creating a strange reversal of the community gossip that had preceded the barbecue incident. Instead of whispered criticism about my impractical career choices, people were now discussing my success with a mixture of genuine pride and opportunistic association. The same neighbors and community members who had previously treated my writing as an embarrassing hobby were suddenly eager to claim connection to a local author who had achieved national recognition. The most significant challenge was managing contact from family members who had learned about the Oprah selection through community gossip or social media mentions. Uncle Marcus himself called my phone repeatedly, leaving voicemails that alternated between attempts at reconciliation and demands that I discuss the situation with him directly. His messages revealed a fundamental inability to understand that his behavior at the barbecue had permanently altered our relationship and that professional success didn't obligate me to restore family connections that had proven toxic and destructive. Trevor sent a text message congratulating me on the achievement, while carefully avoiding any reference to the barbecue incident or his role in facilitating Uncle Marcus's attack. His message felt hollow and opportunistic, like an attempt to maintain association with my success without acknowledging or apologizing for his previous complicity in trying to destroy my confidence and career prospects. The most honest family response came from my father, who called to express genuine pride in my achievement while also acknowledging that he had been wrong to minimize Uncle Marcus's behavior and my response to it. His apology was partial and imperfect, but it represented the first admission from any family member that my treatment at the barbecue had been inappropriate and harmful. However, the family reconciliation attempts felt irrelevant compared to the genuine celebration and support I received from the professional and creative community I had built over the previous months. My writers group organized a celebration dinner at a local restaurant, where I was surrounded by people who had supported my career development through encouragement, practical advice, and collaborative opportunities. The television appearance with Oprah was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon taping that would air the following Monday. The experience of sitting across from one of the most successful media personalities in the world, discussing my books and personal journey with someone who genuinely understood and valued creative persistence, felt like the culmination of everything I had worked toward for 7 years. During the interview, Oprah asked me to describe the challenges I had faced while building my writing career, and I found myself talking honestly about family opposition, financial sacrifice, and the isolation that came with pursuing unconventional goals. When she asked specifically about moments when I had considered giving up, I described the barbecue incident in detail, explaining how Uncle Marcus's public humiliation had initially felt like confirmation of my family's doubts about my choices. But that moment of cruel rejection actually clarified something important for me, I explained to Oprah and her television audience. It helped me understand that seeking approval from people who don't share or support your values is a waste of emotional energy that could be better invested in building relationships with people who genuinely want to see you succeed. Oprah's response to this story was immediate and powerful. What your uncle did was try to shame you into abandoning your dreams, but instead he freed you from the burden of seeking validation from people who were never going to provide it. Sometimes, the worst thing that happens to us becomes the catalyst for the best thing that could happen to us. The episode aired to an audience of millions, generating immediate and overwhelming response from viewers who connected with themes of family dysfunction, creative persistence, and the courage required to pursue authentic paths despite opposition. Within hours of the broadcast, my books had moved to the top of multiple bestseller lists, and my email inbox was flooded with messages from readers sharing their own stories of family conflict and creative struggle. The commercial success was dramatic and life-changing. Within 6 months of the Oprah appearance, I had sold over 200,000 copies of my combined novels, earned enough money to quit my part-time library job, and received multiple offers from traditional publishers interested in my future work. The financial security that had eluded me for 7 years was achieved almost overnight through the power of authentic storytelling and strategic professional networking. More importantly, the public validation of my work and personal story had created a platform for helping other aspiring writers who faced similar challenges with family opposition and financial constraints. I began speaking at writing conferences, leading workshops on independent publishing, and mentoring authors who were struggling to balance creative ambitions with practical responsibilities and social pressures. The most profound personal change was the complete elimination of my need for family approval or validation. The success and recognition I had achieved came from people who valued my work and respected my dedication, creating a sense of professional and personal satisfaction that was independent of family relationships or community opinion. Uncle Marcus never apologized for burning my book or acknowledged that his predictions about my career had been spectacularly wrong. However, his silence and the distance maintained by other complicit family members felt like victory rather than loss. I had built a life and career based on my own values and vision, surrounded by people who supported my goals and celebrated my achievements. The studio apartment above the hardware store was replaced by a beautiful house with a dedicated writing office, but the discipline and focus that had sustained me through years of financial constraint remained central to my daily routine. Success had changed my circumstances but not my commitment to the craft and community that had ultimately provided the validation my family never could. Looking back, the barbecue incident that had felt like devastating betrayal was actually the moment when my real life began. Uncle Marcus had intended to destroy my confidence and force me to abandon my dreams, but instead he had freed me from the exhausting effort of seeking approval from people who were incapable of providing it. His cruelty had become the catalyst for my liberation, and his attempt to burn my books had ultimately elevated them to a platform he could never have imagined or prevented. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.